Facepalm America, I'm Beowulf Rockland. Thank you so much for being here today. I really appreciate that you listen. As always, you can go to facepalmamerica.com for more information about the show, to listen to past episodes, and connect with us on social media. I have discussed this before, but the right in America is constantly harping on undocumented immigrants seeking asylum in the United States. But they never talk about the impact that lax U.S. gun laws have in creating that situation. Here to discuss this with us today is Ieva Jusionyte. She is a legal and medical anthropologist and associate professor at Brown University, the author of the award-winning ethnography Threshold, Emergency Responders on the U.S.-Mexico Border, and most recently, the author of Exit Wounds, How America's Guns Fuel Violence Across the Border. Ieva Jusionyte, thank you so much for being with us today. I appreciate you being here.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
So the far right in America is always talking about, and the language they use is obviously pretty offensive, but an influx of illegal aliens. But there's also a huge influx of guns that goes from the U.S. into Mexico, isn't there?
That's correct. Influx, or you could say the Iron River of guns flowing southbound. Yeah.
So, I mean, that really, the dynamic here, I mean, these aren't isolated things. They don't just happen to be like seeking asylum. They're really terrible conditions in parts of Mexico, and that has to do with the guns that create, in part, the violence that I mean, it's all connected together, isn't it?
That's like putting two and two together. When I was doing research on the border, primarily for my past book that is helping refugees and asylum seekers and migrants who get injured trying to get into the United States, only then I started noticing these signs on all the southbound lanes, on the border crossings to Mexico that says guns and ammunition are prohibited in Mexico. And I thought, how interesting. So these people are fleeing something that is clearly the result of our obsession with guns, our very powerful gun industry and gun dealers that sell the guns that create those conditions of violence that then people are trying to run away from. Obviously, it's not the same for all refugees, but for Mexicans particularly. And Mexicans remain the largest group, the national group of people who are encountered on the U.S.-Mexico border.
Yeah. It also certainly ties in, I would think, with the massive demand for drugs just to the north of Mexico in our country. So we're demanding that drugs come our way, and we're insisting that essentially that massive amounts of guns be exported. It sounds like a ready-made situation for horrors, doesn't it?
The drugs, yes, we want the drugs, and the drugs are supplied by various groups of organized criminal organizations in Mexico that compete for these routes to supply us the drugs. In order to compete, they need firepower, they need weapons that they cannot get in Mexico, but it's very easy for them to get them in the United States. In Arizona, Texas, southbound, the inspections are almost non-existent on the border. There are about 10,000 gun dealerships in states bordering Mexico. So it's definitely connected to the drugs that we want. And then we send the guns that enable the supply of drugs.
Now, it's interesting that you say that the inspections are virtually non-existent. I mean, I watch sometimes. There's a program on National Geographic that is focused on how agents at various ports of entry are seemingly meticulously checking through everything and finding stuff all the time. But you're saying from your observation, your studies, and what you found, that's not really the case.
Well, there are plenty of Border Patrol agents and officers that work for Customs and Border Protection, but they are focused on what is getting into the country. So They are focused on confiscated drugs, They're focused on finding people who don't have authorization to enter the country, and they are much, much less interested in catching guns going in the opposite direction.
Right.
In terms of allocating how many people are staffing which lanes, mostly they care about northbound and not southbound flows of goods.
Right. So you can check out, but you can't check in a manner of
Yes.
speaking. You once worked as an EMT along the U.S.-Mexico border. What was the impact that you saw that these weapons have?
Well, I actually, before I started working as an EMT on the US-Mexico border, I was also an EMT and paramedic right here in the United States.
Right.
I started in Massachusetts, then in
Right.
Florida. So I have seen the impact of gun violence in
Sure.
our communities in the United States. When I moved to the border, the injuries that we saw were not necessarily kind of immediately visible, because the people who were running away, they were not running away because they got shot. They were running away because a family member was kidnapped, or another person in the family was shot, or they were threatened through extortion rackets. So very few of them actually showed like gunshot wounds by the time they presented at the border. But they had various other injuries associated with the travel to cross the border. So leg fractures, and if they fell off the wall, or dehydration if they travel through the desert. So these are kind of also the consequences of guns, but they are not immediate. And that's why
Right.
the very title of the book is Exit Wounds. And it's not so narrowly kind of physical wounds where the bullet
Right.
leaves the body, but it's what are the broader social effects that make the entire community or society injured, wounded, impacted by our gun laws and guns themselves.
Right. It's the wounds that cause people to leave the country, as opposed to the wounds that they receive specifically, literally and physically, and those can be like just as harmful on a societal scale.
That's correct. So wounds that are passed even through generations and shared communally. Yes.
How far does this go back in the history between the United States and Mexico?
Such a good question. So Mexico has very limited gun industry and had historically. So from the very first years of Mexican statehood in the 19th century, most of the guns for various factions were coming from the United States. During the Mexican Revolution a century ago, various factions fighting for control, whether we in the US maybe more know about Pancho Villa because he was here, right here in the borderlands, or Venustiano Carranza, who ended up winning. All of them were getting guns from the United States, mostly. So gun smuggling is nothing new. What is new is the types of guns that are being smuggled. That is the problem also in this country, the very powerful semi-automatic rifles and 50 caliber Barretts that are not the same as Remingtons that you would use for hunting back in the day. And also the organized crime groups that became so much more powerful than the state, than the government or the police forces in Mexico. So that's new.
And what is the balance of power as it stands between criminal groups and the government in Mexico, and how has that shifted and ebbed and flowed over the course of the last generation or two? Is it just thorough dominance by the criminal gangs, or how does that play out exactly? I suppose it's regional to an extent.
Regional, yes. So there are some regions that are more safe and where the state is more powerful, and there are others where criminal groups are more powerful. After the revolution, for about 70 years, Mexico was governed by this one party, the Institutional Revolutionary Party.
PRI,
And
right.
that party had kind of patronage relationships with various crime bosses because crime existed since we had prohibition in this country and somebody had to smuggle us alcohol, right,
Yeah,
from Mexico.
right.
So, but there were very clear lines of kind of command back in the day, or the state kind of controlled organized crime. All of that changed about 20 plus years ago when democratic elections resumed in Mexico, and no one party was controlling organized crime groups. They multiplied. And that kind of coincided with the expiration of assault weapons ban in the United States, which was more bad news.
Yeah.
So now there are certain regions in Mexico, like Tamaulipas or Veracruz, where local governments, regional governments, and even going all the way to the federal government are very much implicated in
Yeah.
organized crime. And there are certain regions that are quite safe. So it's kind of a patchwork, and it's very
Yeah.
hard to tell Americans who go on a spring break and don't necessarily see this violence in the country just how complicated the system is. There is 90% impunity for murder. So, and this is for murder. If we're talking about
Yeah.
extortion or just theft, there is almost no consequences for criminal groups, and therefore people cannot turn to local law enforcement because they are often working together with organized crime groups. So it's just a very bad security situation.
It doesn't seem, even with the waning power of groups like the National Rifle Organization in the United States, the industry overall still seems very powerful, still seems to have a hold on politicians in the United States of America. It does not seem likely that they are going to implement any significant form of gun control anytime soon. What then can we do? What steps can the United States, either at a federal or a state level or any level, do to stem this flow?
Super difficult question. So on the one hand, I think the flow of guns is somewhat maybe going down in a way because guns last a very long time and Mexico is flushed with guns. What they do need is ammunition. And buying ammunition in the United States is not regulated at all. You can buy truckloads of ammunition.
Yeah.
You don't need to pass background checks. So I mean, there are certain things that have been happening recently after the mass shooting at Uvalde School.
Right.
Gun trafficking became a federal crime. It never used to be. So most people caught engaging in this activity were just prosecuted for paperwork violations, saying to gun dealers that they were buying guns for themselves and not for others. But now it is a bigger crime, which will definitely discourage more people. However, as long as there is demand, there will be supply. That's how illicit economies work. So unless there is less demand in Mexico for guns, and that means there has to be more trustworthy institutions of justice and law enforcement. And on our end of things, it's almost less to do with gun control, although an assault weapons ban would do wonders, but also the reducing the demand for drugs would help.
So if we were to reduce the demand for drugs, then that could in turn, reduce the demand for guns. Shrink the drug importation industry in Mexico, reduce corruption, and perhaps make that's a long chain and a tall order. But I guess really ultimately it starts here in the United States, because like on so many different levels, we are the source of this problem. So we really have to look to ourselves, it seems like, as opposed to, and we do this all the time, blaming Mexico or blaming other countries for the problems that we are actively creating.